giving our series of conferences on reflections on the 10 Commandments. Today we're going to conclude our reflection on the 6th Commandment. We've spent all June reflecting on the 6th Commandment. We'll conclude today by mentioning 7 sins or offenses against this commandment which we haven't spoken of yet. So I think this is a PG-rated homily. I think we'll be okay with it, though. We'll make our way through it. PG. We're going to talk a little bit about masturbation, fornication, pornography, prostitution, rape, polygamy, incest. Doesn't sound like a PG homily, but it will be. Remember, all sins against the 6th commandment are mortal sins. Ex toto genere is the Latin phrase that means that the matter is always grave. To sin against chastity is never really a light issue. The Catechism speaks at number 2352 about masturbation, calls it an intrinsically and gravely disordered action. So objectively speaking, self-abuse, as it's called, is always a serious sin. However, the Catechism here notes that subjectively there may be factors which lessen the degree of the sin. It mentions specifically affective immaturity, force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety, or other psychological or social factors that can lessen, if not reduce to a minimum, moral culpability, unquote. So the subjective culpability is not always easy to gauge regarding that sinful habit, but it should also always be confessed. Paragraph 2353 speaks of fornication, which is sexual union between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, clearly a mortal sin. Also keep in mind that any sexual activity outside of marriage, even just putting our hands where our bathing suits or their bathing suits should be covered, that's all mortal sin. Got to be careful about that. So it's not just strictly fornication, that's a serious matter. Paragraph 2353 speaks also of pornography, saying that pornography does grave injury to the dignity of its participants, so the actors, the vendors, the public, since each one becomes an object of base pleasure and illicit profit for others. It immerses all who are involved in the illusion of a fantasy world, unquote. We say, well, what's wrong with living or escaping into a fantasy world, right? Well, what's wrong with that is that Christ died to save us from reality, right? From the reality of sin. He didn't die to save us from fantasy. So if you want to live in a fantasy world, Jesus won't save you from that. Pornography is a fantasy world. It's the illusion of love. It's two-dimensional counterfeit. I'm sure with technology, pretty soon it'll be three-dimensional as well, but it'll still be a counterfeit. It'll still be false love. Catechism at number 2355 speaks of the sin of prostitution. It's a grave sin for the one who sells themselves and for the one who buys them as well. The Catechism adds this. It says, while it's always gravely sinful to engage in prostitution, the imputability, so the culpability of the offense, can be attenuated, meaning lessened, by destitution, blackmail, or social pressure, unquote. So some people are forced into prostitution or sex trafficking or made prostitutes against their will. So if our will is compromised into doing something that's wrong that lessens the guilt of the sin, there may even be no guilt if it's purely against our will. So the Lord is understanding in these things. He's not unjust. He has a heart of mercy for those who get caught in horrible and desperate situations. Continuing on that theme, paragraph 2356 speaks of the sin of rape. It says, rape deeply wounds the respect, freedom, and physical and moral integrity to which every person has a right. It says it causes grave damage that can mark the victim for life. It's always an intrinsically evil act, unquote. So rape victims can even block out the event or events as a protective mechanism. That happens very often. It's one of God's ways of protecting victims who, because of their young age or for other reasons, wouldn't be able to handle the trauma and the horror of what they've experienced. When the memories resurface or begin to resurface, that's when we need to be strong and courageous enough to address them. Think of it as the Lord saying, I'd like for us to deal with these things now. That's why I'm letting the memories resurface. We need to bring whatever is in the darkness into the light so that we can release it and work on healing from it. This is where a good Christian counselor could be helpful as far as helping us to deal with the trauma instead of running away from it or trying to be controlled or being controlled by it. So we have to be careful about that. 2 other sins against the 6th commandment and against the dignity of marriage, which we'll close with here, are polygamy and incest. Polygamy is spoken of in paragraph 2386. It says their conjugal communion is radically contradicted by polygamy, says the Catechism. This, in fact, directly negates the plan of God, which was revealed from the beginning, because it's contrary to the equal personal dignity of men and women who, in matrimony, give themselves with a love that is total and therefore unique and exclusive, unquote, says the Catechism. So the question is, well, why was polygamy allowed in the Old Testament but not in the New Testament? And now, in the age of the church, why is it not allowed? Well, the short answer is that God tolerated it in the Old Testament. He was patient. He put up with the practice that wasn't according to his will until he could lead the people into a fuller and clearer understanding of his design for them. The clearer and fuller understanding of his will is found in the revelation of Jesus Christ. Hebrews 1 verses 1 through 2 says, "In times past, God spoke in partial and various ways to our ancestors through the prophets. In these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son." In other words, God's revelation in the Old Testament was partial and incomplete. Jesus Christ is the fullness of that revelation, and God's will for us is made clear and complete through Christ. And Christ no longer tolerates polygamy. We see that clearly in the New Testament. So for those who come from cultures or religions where polygamy is acceptable and now they have a conversion, they want to join the church, they cannot maintain multiple wives. The Catechism says, quote, "The predicament of a man who, desiring to convert to the gospel, is obliged to repudiate one or more wives with whom he has shared years of conjugal life is understandable. However, polygamy is not in accord with the moral law." And then it says, "The Christian who has previously lived in polygamy has a grave duty and justice to honor the obligations contracted in regard to his former wives and his children," unquote. So it costs a lot for someone who's lived that way to become Catholic and to become a faithful follower of Christ, but the reward is worth it. The reward is eternal life. Lastly, the Catechism at paragraphs 2388 and 2389 speaks of the sin of incest. It says, "Incest designates intimate relations between relatives or in-laws within a degree that prohibits marriage between them. It corrupts family relationships and marks a regression towards animality," says the Catechism. I don't think we need to comment on this one too much. Obviously, any type of sexual relationship which is outside of a true spousal relationship is corruptive and needs to be corrected. So there may be other sins against the 6th commandment which we overlooked this past month. However, I think for the most part we've covered everything that needs to be covered in these reflections. Let's just remember that we need to take seriously guarding our mind, guarding our eyes, and guarding our heart. Proverbs 4 verse 23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life." So we have to aim at purity and chastity if we want to live in the wonderful freedom of the children of God. And if we want to avoid embracing the lies of the popular unholy culture that we live in. Let's ask Our Lady for the grace to be faithful to this all-important and far too abused commandment. Praise be Jesus and Mary, now and forever.